Hey, everybody. I wanted to tell you about an amazing New Testament scholar that's visiting Houston, Texas. I'm actually going. It's June 9th through 12th. It's N.T. Wright. He's going to be speaking on the book of Ephesians. N.T. Wright is one of the best New Testament scholars in the world. So it's in Houston, Texas. Go to eventbrite, BRITE.com. Do a search in Houston for N.T. Wright. And you can also join in. Once again, it's June 9th through the 12th, and it's going to be amazing. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Cristina Rosetti, author of Joseph Musser, a Mormon fundamentalist. We're going to learn more about Joseph Musser's life and found out that he was kind of a big theology guy as far as fundamentalist Mormonism. We'll find out more as Heber J. Grant really cracks down on fundamentalism, and we'll dive into that idea that fundamentalists talk about, that priesthood is independent of the LDS Church. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
Right. And so Lauren Woolley takes that, and he then continues this process where he ordains other men that are called the Council of Friends. So his dad, John Wickersham Woolley, John W. Woolley, Charles Zitting, J. Leslie Broadbent, John Y. Barlow, Joseph Musser become
That's 5
men. Yes. And so, and when Joseph Musser is ordained, it's like he talks about, he was like, I was ordained an apostle to the world. Like it's like a...
And this is in 1921.
Joseph Musser's ordination is 1929.
Okay.
Joseph Musser is excommunicated in 1921, and he jumps ship to the fundamentalist movement and starts attending these meetings and starts meeting people. And very early on, I mean, Joseph Musser was smart. He kept a diary, a very thorough diary. And so because of that, the early years of the movement is really told through the pen of Joseph Musser. And the Woolley story is told through the pen of Joseph Musser, because Musser is keeping the meeting minutes. Musser is writing pamphlets. Very early on, I mean, Musser really struggles financially and to hold down a job in a time when people hate polygamists. He's losing his job. And that ends up being fine in a lot of ways because Lauren Woolley ends up telling him, well, your calling is to spread the movement. And so because of that, Joseph Musser ends up publishing a monthly periodical, Truth Magazine. He ends up publishing a lot of pamphlets. He ends up really being a figurehead of this movement. Eventually, as members of the council die, he does become the senior member, and he's the president of the priesthood at the end of his life.
Okay. So 1921 is where the first Council of Friends were ordained. Is that right? Or was it till 29?
So the ordinations happen kind of sporadically. They kind of happen. They're not all at one time.
But which Woolley was 21?
That's when Lauren Woolley starts telling the story.
Lauren Woolley. And so then he ordains his father next?
He starts, I don't know if his dad is the immediate next one. I know the Musser story.
Okay.
I think Musser, is actually the last one in 1929.
Okay. So over the next 8 years.
But Musser was also still a member of the LDS Church until 1921, which is very late for a practicing polygamist, an unapologetic polygamist, a polygamist who is still getting married to other people, to be in the church.
Right.
Like that's March 1921 is late to still be going strong.
Well, because I think last time we talked a little bit about him, and you told the story about how the apostles called him in.
Yeah, in 1909.
Can you tell that again?
Yeah, he was called into a disciplinary hearing in 1909. It was in the Salt Lake Temple. And it's the longest diary entry he gives. And it's an interesting diary entry because he talks about how he was called into a meeting with like Rutger Clausen was there, and Anthony W. Ivins was there, and Francis Lyman was there, and like all these people were there. And he specifically notes all these people were polygamist or have done plural marriages after the manifesto. And so the beginning of his diary entry, he's like, this is hypocrisy. Like, what's going on? And he does something really interesting in the meeting is, they kind of ask him about plural marriage. He's unapologetic. Like he's not pretending he's something he's not. But during the meeting, he starts telling them that this is out of order. None of you are my stake president. And they're all just like, You can imagine them just being like, oh, that's true. And that's true. They weren't his stake president, and that is out of order. Like, we don't do it that way. I mean, who's we? You all don't do it that way. That's not how we do it. And so he notes that, and they tell him, yeah, that's true. We'll let your stake president handle it. The problem is his stake president's a polygamist. And like on the side, like he and his stake president are like secretly plotting, like reviving the United Order. So like that's not going to happen.
So the stake president wasn't going to excommunicate.
Absolutely not.
Well, that's hard to believe given the fact that the stake president gets all his line orders from the apostles, right?
Right. And I think I have this quote of the end that I was looking for, that he ends up, at the end of this meeting, he walks away vowing to not change. And he specifically says, I had a definite testimony of the sacredness and correctness of the principle of plural marriage, and I hope to be prepared to lay down my life for it if necessary. Like, he was willing to die for this. Like, he was
like John Taylor, ride or die.
I mean, last of the badass prophets. Just kidding. And so, I mean, there was a sense that he didn't care at all. And we know he didn't care because he kept getting married. I mean, and really the important thing, which a lot of people are familiar with now because of so much of the great work that has come out about it, when we talk about him getting married polygamously after the manifesto, it was Matthias Cowley doing his marriages, who was an apostle. Judson Tolman did one of his sealings, who was a patriarch when patriarchs were allowed to do that. And so he wasn't doing these kind of like weird back alley sealings with like no-name people. Like, they had authority to do it, which really complicates the story, of course, of post-manifesto polygamy.
Now, Cowley got dropped from the quorum in 1906, though.
With John W. Taylor.
And so was this sealing after 1906?
Nope, 1902. So he was sealed to marry Caroline Hill.
1902 it was still sort of okay.
Rick, the first manifesto is in 1890.
Yeah, but there's the 1904 manifesto.
Right, but he's also sealed again in 1907.
By Cowley?
By Judson Tolman.
Okay.
Who was the patriarch, who did a lot of, so I have the sealing record for that sealing, and it lists a group of men who the sealing was authorized by, and Matthias Cowley is listed as one of them.
And maybe we should recap, because I know if you talk to the average Mormon, we're like, oh yeah, polygamy ended 1890. Yeah. But a lot of people, especially fundamentalists, were like, well, it's a wink and a nod. And even Woodruff was allowing people to go to Mexico to continue polygamy. Yeah. It was like, and Canada, okay. And so it was like, well, this is for the United States only. I mean, that was kind of the understanding between 1890 and 1904 when the Smoot hearings happened.
I mean,
and then
it's complicated, right? Yeah. I mean, the government doesn't like polygamy. The government, and I get where Woodruff is coming from, right? The government is disincorporating the church. The government is taking property. The government is threatening to taking the temples.
And they can't do anything in Canada or Mexico.
Like, yeah, and I mean, this is like, that's a big deal. Like, they're going to take the temples. Like, if you believe that the temple is the place where families are sealed for eternity, and now the feds are coming in and taking your building, and you know that you can get out of it if you simply say, we're not doing this anymore. Yeah, of course you're going to do that. Now, it is kind of like I feel a little bad for John Taylor, who was just willing to die, and then the next guy's like, that's fine. That's a little bit of a bummer. But so I get where Woodruff is coming from. The problem, though, is you can't tell people for years. Like Brigham Young, no one becomes gods or the sons of gods without entering into the principle of plural marriage. You can't tell people that and then be like, just kidding, monogamy's cool too. Like, so there is a really difficult tension there. Right. And so, of course, I mean, the other problem, 1890, they say no more polygamy. Does that mean we all get divorced? Does that mean we have to live separately? Does that, like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, how do we wind it down?
Like, it's one thing to theoretically say no more polygamy. It's another to, like, let's live this. And so, and the problem is in 1904, when Joseph F. Smith says no more polygamy, it's the same problem of that. It's only been, it hasn't been that long since 1890.
Right.
And again, are we doing the mass divorce thing? Are we, like, what are we doing? Again, like, John Taylor's not that long ago. Right. And this memory of this man who was willing to die for it. And now we're like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And so and I mean, I think in some way this is a reason why I find the fundamentalist position, I mean, we were talking about this yesterday, slightly more tenable you can say Brigham Young's wrong. Great. But like, also if he's the prophet, I mean, what are you going to do? And the people who are doing polygamy, Brigham Young said, you have to do this. And people have sacrificed so much to do it. And now we're just getting divorced and calling it good?
Well, I mean, nobody was saying that at the time.
Right.
The idea was in 1890, hey, don't do this again. You can continue to live with your polygamous wives, but don't get any new ones. Wink, wink, except in Mexico and Canada.
Or if Matthias Cowley or John W. Taylor do it, and then it's fine.
Yeah. And so then the Reed Smoot hearings come. They want to kick him out of Congress.
I mean, we also have this like really difficult thing which I think is the interesting thing about the fundamentalist movement, is there is no fundamentalist movement in 1904.
Right.
There's people who are sympathetic to polygamy. That is what they are.
Right.
And today, of course, we have like the very sharp distinction of who is a Mormon fundamentalist and who is, I mean, it's not that sharp of a distinction. There's people who want to be both at the same time.
Right.
That's fair. But we kind of are able to differentiate what makes someone one versus the other. But in the reason why the 1910s, 20s are so interesting is it's just people who are invested in polygamy. So, I mean, this is why people are always shocked and scandalized that like Hugh B. Brown's daughter marries Rulon Jeffs. And why is Hugh B. Brown's dad like ordaining or giving patriarchal blessings to like early fundamentalist women? Like what's going on? And it's not that he was a fundamentalist. It's not that Zola Brown was a fundamentalist. It's that this is a weird time.
Yeah.
It's not like these weren't, we kind of call it the proto-fundamentalist movement, but these sharp lines between 1890 and until 1930, 1933 is a hard cutoff.
Right.
But until 1933, it's just a weird moment.
Yeah, we're in transition.
Yeah, and I hope people understand that it's not when people talk about these really strange marriages and interactions between people who we associate with fundamentalism, it's not that these people were fundamentalist. It's that this is a rough period.
Yeah.
And everyone is just trying to figure out, where do we go?
Yeah. Well, and so Joseph F. Smith in 1904 gets hauled into Congress. Are you doing polygamy? I mean, this is where the temple ceremonies
and like the answer is yes. The answer is yes, because a plural wife is having a kid. Like the answer is yes.
But that's why.
But Reed Smoot's not.
Correct. Reed Smoot is a monogamist. He's an apostle. Is he the only monogamous apostle at the time? I think. I
don't know if he's the only one, but he is a monogamist.
Yeah. And so apostle / senator Reed Smoot, because Joseph F. Smith issues the second manifesto in 1904 and says, okay, we mean business this time.
Right.
And so when Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor, son of John Taylor,
yep.
are apostles performing polygamous marriages, they get dropped. One of them gets disfellowshipped. The other one gets kicked out, excommunicated.
Right.
So that's the 1906 is where we set the example. Okay, we mean business this time. We're kicking apostles out for doing it.
This is true, but at the same time, right? We're calling in Joseph Musser in 1909. He's in the 105th quorum of the 70. I mean, it's not like he's not like a big deal. We're calling him in 1909 and doing nothing about it, and just being like, all right, I guess go about your day. And in 1909, like he's continuing to like preach polygamy over the pulpit. He's writing down. I mean, he's keeping a detailed journal, noting that a lot of people are doing that. He's not the only one. And granted, he's in an area with a stake president who's a polygamist. He's a known polygamist. He's not hiding it. And so he happens to be in an area of Salt Lake where that was happening.
But at least in 1904, well, this is still kind of a fuzzy area. I mean, but the idea is don't take any more new ones, but there's still some new ones happening. John W. Taylor's doing sealings. So
I also still think, though, that like when we look at the diaries of these people, I think it's really easy to like look back and say in 1904, we now know. But like when you read and I know Musser ends up being a unique situation, but when he's writing his diary in 1904, he doesn't know he's going to become a fundamentalist. You know, I mean, he doesn't know that. And so when we look at his diary, like his 1904 General Conference diary entries, he writes the day of and he's like, President Joseph F. Smith spoke over the pulpit at conference, said he issued the second manifesto. Then I went to a meeting and we talked about, are we going to make new statues for Brigham Young and Joseph Smith to celebrate the anniversary of the restoration of the church? Anyway, went home and saw Rose. Like,
these are all unrelated.
like he's just like telling you like how mundane the second manifesto is to him, that for us, we look at it, we're like 1904, like this is the hard end. And the second manifesto is going to go into the canon of LD. They're going to read it and come follow me. But for the people who lived it, for a lot of people who lived it, it was like, well, General Conference happened and they once again said, we're not doing polygamy. So, I mean, I guess we're
repeat of 1890.
Got to go to that meeting for statues. Like, it's just so mundane. And I mean, I think the mundane reality of it, I remember I mentioned this at a benchmark event I did, but when I got to the day of his excommunication in his diary, I was so interested. What's he going to say?
Yeah.
Like, what's he going to say? Like, this is the moment that changes his life. This is the moment that he loses everything. This is the moment that he's separated from the priesthood, from everything. And I get to the day, and there's a little Deseret News clipping of his excommunication notice, because it was back when they would publish it in the Deseret.
He put it in the diary?
He taped it in, and it just said, routine day at the office. Because it just didn't matter. It just didn't matter.
And is this because he had a second anointing? Because
he did
it
have a
doesn't
second
matter?
anointing. Yeah. So,
okay.
So he was married in the Logan Temple. And one of the so this period of his life around his marriage is interesting. It's after the manifesto, but he gets married young. He serves in the southern states, has a very average mission. His mission president is J. Golden Kimball. Mm-hmm. They remain good friends. Even after his excommunication, he goes to Kimball's funeral. They write letters to each other. Like, they remain friends. J. Golden Kimball's just like, whatever. I don't know what's going on with this guy, with this like past elder. But he has a great mission, and he comes home and gets married to Rose Selms Borquist in the Logan Temple. And there was and then he gets his second anointing, and in his diary he writes special temple blessings. He doesn't write second anointing. He just writes.
What year is this, approximately?
In 1899, November 30th, 1899, in the Logan Temple. And the interesting part, I think, about his second anointing, not only the fact that he notes it in his diary, which I guess people would, I don't know. At the time, I mean, I talk a little bit about in the book how second anointings have a sharp decline after the third manifesto in 1933. And this is probably a little bit of why. He was 27.
Wow, that's really young.
Like, the highest ordinance, the highest blessings available in the LDS Church is given to a child. Like, it's just, I mean, I know like 27-year-olds are adults and a lot of people get married at 27, whatever, but like, that's pretty young to receive like the fullness of everything.
Right.
So he and his wife receive it. It really means a lot to him. It's a big deal, but the problem.
But that's why the excommunication doesn't matter.
It means nothing. But the problem, especially, is the next month in his later recollections. In his next month, he notes that a, quote, special messenger came to him and told him that he has been selected to keep polygamy alive. Now, this is an interesting situation because the special messenger is never named. There's some kind of speculation of who it might have been. And this is a retroactive kind of reflection on his life. It doesn't note this in his diaries or anything. And he does note in his later recollection of his life that he was torn by this because he recognized that this is an eternal principle. He also recognized that this is against the church. And he's at a crossroads. Do I go with the eternal principles of God, or do I go with the temporal church? We know what way he goes, ultimately.
So it's a man, it's not an angel.
It's a person.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we think it's Brigham Jr.
Okay.
I mean, that's kind of the impression that is given. But that ends up kind of being the catalyst he goes to his wife, Rose. They talk about it. She struggles initially. She goes and prays about it. She determines that this is correct.
So he's a monogamist at this time.
Yes, with
So
Rose.
he's a 27-year-old monogamist. Okay.
And then he marries Marilyn Seahill a few years later under Matthias Cowley. They get married in his house And
In Cowley's house.
in Musser's house.
Musser's house. Okay.
Musser's house. And
Which is funny because these are supposed to happen in a temple, right?
but at the time, like, this is still the time where people have like home altars. This is still the time where like people are doing prayer circles at home. So there's still like a lot of like, it's also against the rules.
Yeah.
And so Matthias Cowley was doing sealing. We have Cowley's sealing record, and they're kind of happening everywhere. If you look at one of them, if you look at Matthias Cowley's records, like it says like in car.
Oh, wow.
Like,
because I knew they did them on trains and
there's
anywhere.
one in like a walk-in.
because it's a secret practice.
Yeah,
right?
there's one in like an ice chest, like a walk-in freezer, basically. Like some of the times, like the patriarchs are like wearing like masks. I don't know. It's like a very like, you're going to get excommunicated. So of course you're going to do it in a weird freezer with a mask on. I don't know. There's probably better ways than that. He ends up then getting married later to L.S.R. Shipp Jr.
So this is number 3.
Number 3. The problem then, what ends up doing it for him with the excommunication is there starts to be rumor that he was thinking about taking a 4th wife. He never did. This is an important point. He never did. And so what's interesting about that is he didn't do anything against the church, but he thought about it. And at this point in the 1920, by that time, having incorrect belief in Mormonism starts to be handled. Because it's very easy to get rid of someone who's like being sealed again. But what if they just believe in it?
Right.
Then what do we do with them? He's excommunicated in 1921. But like you said, there's this big problem of he has had his calling and election made sure.
Mm-hmm.
How do you excommunicate someone who has had their calling and election made sure? That's a very hard thing to do. Musser, another reason I think Musser was so compelling to people in a way that other fundamentalist leaders might not have been is we do not have any evidence. Contrary to, I have long-standing disagreement with Lindsay Hansen Park on this, that we don't have any, we would both agree we don't know, but she tends to believe that maybe other people had theirs. I don't. But he had a second anointing, and that's interesting. If nothing else, he knows what that ritual is. Right. He knows how it's short. It's a short ritual. He can replicate it. Now, a big question, does he replicate it? I would argue yes. I think there's evidence that I think there is certainly evidence he gave it to his wife, Lucy, a woman he marries significantly later. And we know that just from the way that he talks about a ritual she's performing. And so that makes him compelling, all to say. And so by 1920, when they're meeting in Nathaniel Baldwin's home and they're talking about this kind of interesting new way of doing priesthood, he's someone that has a very particular priesthood and a particular scale of priesthood that is exciting.
Okay. And so this is Musser. We've still got Woolley, who's is he leading the charge?
Early on, it's fairly unified. Things start to unravel in the unification of the movement. I don't want to say pretty quickly, but there are issues early on. The notable kind of issues are going to prison is a big one, and death. Those are the kind of like, it's a difficult thing. The imprisonment is a really significant factor of Musser's life, not only because he eventually does go to prison. He actually serves the same sentence for the same crime as his dad, who was church historian, Amos Milton Musser. And so in 1920s, things are fine. The 1930s, things stop being fine because Heber J. Grant becomes the president of the LDS Church. And Heber J. Grant, the polygamist, hates polygamy. What an irony.
He's the one. I mean, I know Woodruff gets some crap from fundamentalists, but Grant is the guy. He's the enemy.
Grant's I don't want to say the word apostate because this is not a belief I hold. Grant's an apostate. I don't know. Heber J. Grant is deeply hated by the fundamentalist movement. And this is fair. There's good reason, I would say. Heber J. Grant was a polygamist. So he's kind of like
turncoat.
He's a traitor.
Yeah.
Like and he's a traitor because he has enough wives to go to heaven. And now he's saying other men don't get to do that? Like, what? What a move. What a move.
Because 3 is the minimum, right?
Woolley taught 3.
Yeah.
3, 5, 7 are the degrees of glory in heaven, according to Woolley.
Right.
But yeah, he got in. Like, Heber J. Grant, like, slid in. And so that's annoying. But then suddenly he, like, hates polygamy. The reason he hates polygamy, I think, are, from his comments about it, are twofold. The first is he just straight up thinks it's embarrassing. Like, he thinks it's embarrassing. He thinks it's an embarrassment. He talks about this. He also, one of the really interesting things about him, in 1931 at April General Conference, Heber J. Grant gets up and he talks about polygamy. And he talks about how there are some people maligning the good name of the church. There are some people saying there's still polygamy. And by that, at this point...
So you think he's specifically talking about Joseph Musser at this point?
Well, but the Council of Friends. Because at this point, Lauren Woolley is... I mean, again, I mentioned Lauren Woolley's not a reliable narrator. But one of the things Lauren Woolley does is Lauren Woolley starts spreading rumors that all the apostles are still living polygamy secretly.
Like adding new wives?
Yeah, like actually fully living, which is not true. But Lauren Woolley is starting to say this, and many people are kind of starting to wonder. And that would be an embarrassment to the church. And so Grant is annoyed. The other thing Grant's annoyed by, though, is Joseph Musser by this point had started to promulgate a very particular idea of the priesthood, which is interesting, that he starts to really make a compelling case that the priesthood and the church can function separately. And he's able to make a compelling case for this exact reason. Rick, what came first? The restoration of the priesthood or the establishment of the church?
Oh, this is where that argument comes from. It was the establishment of the priesthood.
It was. And Joseph Musser was the first to do this.
Okay, so that's where. So that argument can be traced directly to Joseph Musser.
And so I think that this is what I think is his biggest intellectual contribution to the development of fundamentalism, is he's able to... It's true that the priesthood is restored.
1829.
And then a church is established. And the priesthood is kind of... I mean, priesthood in an LDS context of being like the power of God, that is chaotic. That the power of God is on the earth. Like, that's a chaotic idea. And you need something to, like, rein that in. And so a church makes sense. If you think that this is how priesthood works, you should have something that, like, makes sure it doesn't run amok. Mm-hmm. And so it makes sense to have it in that order. And so the conclusion that Musser is able to make is, if that's true, why can't the priesthood still exist outside of the church?
Right.
Not a bad argument. And so he says this, and he writes this really kind of great pamphlet, A Priesthood Issue, on this exact thing. What's interesting is in 1931, Heber J. Grant takes to General Conference and says, there are some who would suggest. And so because of this, I think that there is a case to be made that what I mentioned, that the fundamentalist movement was always watching carefully what the LDS Church was doing. They still watch carefully what the LDS Church
Do they?
was. I mean, they're interested.
Because they don't pay attention to General Conference, not like the ex-Mormons.
I'm in the Facebook groups, and when that Kirtland temple sold...
Well, yeah. The historic temples, I would say, mean a lot to fundamentalist Mormons. But they don't pay attention to General Conference, do they?
I mean, some of them do. When the endowment changes...
But they don't announce that in General Conference. They just change it.
But there's never a more boisterous moment in fundamentalist Facebook groups than when there's endowment changes, because that's such a big part of the claim of, like, they've changed the endowment.
Right.
No, I mean, some do. Some certainly do. Especially when, I mean, they'll follow the hashtag, or most fundamentalists have family that are LDS, and so they'll hear about it. They're in the family group chat. They, like, see their sister's Facebook post. So they pay attention. But also, because so many fundamentalists have LDS family, they're going to pay attention to what religion their family is. Like, it just happens. So Musser watches closer than, like, Musser is tuning in, like, aggressively, and he's writing line by line commentary and circulating it around the Intermountain West. Like, he's really aggressively attuned in a way that might be a little unhealthy, but he's very interested in what his former religion is doing. But in the same way, Heber J. Grant is watching. what his weird excommunicated former people are doing. And so I think there is something to be said that you can't be a fundamentalist if you're not opposing something, if you're not opposing modernism. And you can't be modern if you're not opposing fundamentalism. And so these two traditions under Grant really start to use each other to create a distinct identity of what it is that they are going to be moving forward. And so in the 1930s, I mean, fast forward 2 years, polygamy still doesn't go away. And so Heber J. Grant has to actually do something. And so in 1933, he gets up at General Conference and he says, all right, this is it. You have to stop polygamy. If you are a stake president or a bishop, it's over. So he writes a letter to bishops and stake presidents saying the excommunications have to start. He sends out loyalty oaths. People have to sign these. If they don't sign them, they're out. And then he calls on law enforcement to start cracking down. And so that's when the arrests start. That's when people start getting fired. Kids kind of have to withdraw from school. And that's when this group of Mormons who believe in polygamy start realizing we need to get out of the Salt Lake Valley. Let's go down to southern Utah.
Okay. So the first raids are in about 1933, is that right?
1935 it's not so much a raid, but in 1935 when they go down, they start building houses, and it's just like a media circus of like all of the news goes down there to see this like all of a sudden this like flock of polygamists, and people already lived in southern Utah who weren't polygamists. There was a branch, there was a little stake, the Zion Park stake was there. Like it was just like a normal town. And then all of a sudden it was a polygamist town. And so that was concerning. At the time, Charles Zitting gets arrested, one of the council members. People start getting arrested at this point, and charged for polygamy or for unlawful cohabitation. And because that is the crime. And so we start to see early instances of government interference. At the time, in 1935, from that point forward, when we look at comments from governors, attorney generals in Arizona, all of them note that the LDS Church was at least participating
in the raids.
Yeah.
Okay. And so
or supportive, or I don't want to say participating might be a little too strong, but they were supportive.
Right. And so the third manifesto, is that 33, 34? 33. So
hard cutoff.
So Grant comes in. Does he come in 33?
That's when that happens. April 1933.
No, but when did he become prophet?
I don't know what the LDS Church is doing.
Okay. But anyway, 33, Grant's like, we mean business. We're going to start excommunicating you.
And he actually ends
even
polygamy.
for just belief in polygamy. Because
a loyalty oath is a belief. And the loyalty oaths, I mean, in the book, I published what the loyalty oaths were, one of them, so people can see them. They really go out strong in the Zion Park stake, especially because that's where all the polygamists are. And there was a lot of debate to be had about, do we sign these? And do we lie, like wink and nod, like I'm loyal to President Heber J. Grant and whatever it is that he's doing? Or do we not? Because of just kind of how chaotic things were, eventually it is the case that the Zion Park stake has to be reorganized. The branch, the Rockville branch is dissolved. They just kind of, the LDS Church removes itself from that area. There is no LDS.
Which is now
kind
of the Short Creek.
There is
Except
no
for,
LDS.
It's not really Short Creek anymore. It got changed to Hilldale in Colorado City, right?
So it was always Hilldale. It's colloquially called Short Creek. It's the Twin Cities. But there is no LDS meeting house in Short Creek.
Okay.
And if you were the LDS Church, you would have taken your building out too. Because what's going to who's in there? What are they doing in that church? So 35 is really when we start to see loyalty oaths, arrests, bad news. It's not until 44 that we see the first raid.
Okay.
And that's when Musser goes to prison.
Oh, he was part of the 44 raid?
Yeah, he goes to prison.
I didn't realize that.
Yep, he goes to prison.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Cristina Rosetti, author of Joseph Musser, a Mormon fundamentalist. In our next conversation, we're going to dive into two of the big raids, 1944 and 1953.
In both 1944 and 1953, both men and women go to prison. That's something a lot of people kind of forget about, that women go to prison too for polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
The Salt Lake.
But they're more going after the men than the women, aren't they?
They are, but women go to prison for polygamy. Women are fined. There are some great pictures of very cute, dressed up, fashionable, stylish women sitting in their prison cell, looking very proud of themselves for it. And I think that's I think that is something that is so important, is in this period, to go to prison for polygamy is to be persecuted for your religion. You're Joseph Smith.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.